At its peak, this device was so addictive that doctors gave it a clinical nickname. They called it Crackberry. World leaders refused to travel without it. CEOs slept with it on their nightstands. Entire governments declared it a national security necessity. For nearly a decade, owning one was not just a lifestyle choice, it was a symbol of power, intelligence, and success. Then, in the span of just a few years, it was gone. Not slowly fading into the background the way old technology usually does. Gone. Violently. Publicly. In a way that left the entire business world stunned and asking the same question: how does the most important device on the planet become completely irrelevant almost overnight? This is the story of BlackBerry. And it is one of the most dramatic, painful, and deeply instructive collapses in the history of modern business. To understand what BlackBerry meant to the world, you have to go back to a time before smartphones existed as we know them today. The late 1990s. The internet was young. Mobile phones were getting smaller, but they were still just phones. You could call someone. You could send a basic text message. That was it. Business communication still ran on desktop computers, fax machines, and pagers. If you were a senior executive traveling across the country, staying connected to your office meant finding a hotel business center, logging onto a dial-up connection, and hoping your emails would load before the hourly rate wiped out your expenses budget. It was clunky. It was slow. And for a company called Research in Motion, based out of Waterloo, Canada, it was an enormous opportunity. Research in Motion, RIM, was founded in 1984 by Mike Lazaridis, a young engineering student at the University of Waterloo, and Jim Balsillie, a Harvard-trained businessman who would later become co-CEO. Neither of them set out to change the world on day one. In the beginning, RIM was a modest technology consultancy, doing contract work for local businesses. But Lazaridis had an obsession that would eventually transform the entire planet's relationship with communication. He wanted to send email wirelessly. That idea sounds obvious today. But in the early 1990s, it was borderline radical. The infrastructure did not exist. The hardware did not exist. The business model did not exist. Almost everything about what Lazaridis imagined had to be invented from scratch. And that is exactly what made it so powerful once it worked. But this was only the beginning of a journey far more complicated than anyone inside RIM could have imagined. The first BlackBerry device launched in 1999. It was not a phone. It was a two-way pager with a tiny keyboard and a revolutionary feature: it could send and receive email in real time, anywhere, as long as you had a signal. No desktop computer required. No dial-up connection. No waiting. For the average consumer, this meant nothing. But for the corporate world, it was like giving someone a superpower. Suddenly, a lawyer could respond to a critical filing from the back of a taxi. A banker could approve a deal while boarding a flight. An executive could stay connected during a weekend at their family cabin without driving to the nearest hotel business center. BlackBerry did not just improve communication, it eliminated the concept of being unreachable. Corporations bought them in bulk. Law firms. Investment banks. Government agencies. The device spread through the professional class the way fire spreads through dry wood, fast, unstoppable, and consuming everything in its path. By the early 2000s, BlackBerry had become something that very few technology companies ever achieve. It had become a verb. People said they were going to BlackBerry someone. The device had its own culture, its own etiquette, its own social rules. And it had something even more valuable than any of that. It had trust. BlackBerry's security architecture was genuinely exceptional. Messages were encrypted end-to-end. Data passed through RIM's own servers before reaching the recipient, meaning it was almost impossible to intercept. This was not a marketing claim, it was a technical reality that earned the company relationships that most tech firms can only dream of. The United States government certified BlackBerry for classified communications. The White House used it. Intelligence agencies used it. Barack Obama famously fought to keep his Blackberry when he became president, calling it one of his few non-negotiable demands. When the leader of the free world publicly refuses to give up your product, you are no longer just a technology company. You are infrastructure. And that is precisely where the danger began. By the mid-2000s, Research in Motion was one of the most valuable companies in Canada. Revenue was growing at a pace that defied logic. The stock price had climbed so aggressively that analysts struggled to find the right words to describe it. Lazaridis and Balsillie had become Canadian business legends, celebrated not just as entrepreneurs but as proof that a small university town in Ontario could produce a world-changing technology company. Inside RIM, however, there was a growing tension that outsiders could not see. The company had been built around a single insight, that wireless email was the killer application for mobile business users. Everything RIM made was optimized around that insight. The keyboard. The battery life. The server architecture. The security protocols. Every decision flowed from one belief: the most important thing a mobile device can do is deliver email reliably and securely. That belief had made them billions. And it would also, eventually, destroy them. Because in January 2007, a man named Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and showed the world an iPhone. What happened next surprised everyone, including the people at Blackberry who were watching. When the iPhone was announced, the initial reaction inside RIM was not panic. It was something closer to dismissal. Lazaridis and Balsillie looked at the iPhone and saw its weaknesses before they saw its strengths. The battery life was poor. The keyboard was a glass screen. How could anyone type on that seriously? It had no enterprise-grade security. It ran on the slow AT&T network. In terms of raw email performance for corporate users, the BlackBerry was still vastly superior. What RIM failed to understand, what they perhaps could not allow themselves to understand, was that the iPhone was not competing with BlackBerry on BlackBerry's terms. It was rewriting the terms entirely. Jobs had built a device around a different question. Not how do we deliver email better, but what do people actually want to do with a small computer they carry in their pocket? The answer turned out to be, almost everything. Browse the internet. Watch videos. Play games. Listen to music. Take photos. Navigate cities. And yes, check email, but email as one feature among hundreds, not the entire point of the device. For the average consumer, the choice between a BlackBerry and an iPhone was not even a close contest. The iPhone was beautiful, it was fun. It made technology feel personal in a way that the BlackBerry, for all its professional power, never had. Within months of the iPhone's launch, something was shifting in the market that RIM's internal numbers had not yet caught up to. People were starting to want something different from their phones. And BlackBerry had no answer for that. But a much bigger challenge was approaching, and this one would come from a direction RIM was completely unprepared for. In 2008, Google launched Android. And if the iPhone was a warning, Android was a siege. Unlike Apple, Google was not trying to sell hardware. It was trying to build an ecosystem. Android was a free, open-source operating system that any phone manufacturer in the world could use. Samsung picked it up. HTC picked it up. Motorola picked it up. Suddenly, dozens of companies were producing touchscreen smartphones that could run hundreds of thousands of apps, at price points that undercut BlackBerry across every market segment. RIM found itself in a nightmare scenario. On the premium end, Apple was eating their corporate users as even law firms and banks began allowing iPhones into the workplace. On the mid and low end, Android was capturing the consumer market and the developing world at a speed that was almost incomprehensible. BlackBerry's response was slow, contradictory, and in hindsight, almost tragically miscalculated. They launched touchscreen devices that tried to compete with the iPhone, but kept the physical keyboard on some models, confusing their own product identity. They built an app store that launched years too late, with a fraction of the content available on iOS and Android. They acquired companies, pivoted strategies, announced new operating systems, and scrapped them before they launched. Every quarter, the numbers got worse. Every announcement promised a turnaround that never came. And the people who had once carried Blackberries as status symbols were quietly switching to iPhones and never coming back. There is a particular kind of corporate tragedy that happens when a company knows it needs to change but cannot bring itself to actually change, because changing means admitting that everything it believed was wrong. That is exactly what was happening inside Research in Motion between 2008 and 2012, and watching it unfold was like watching a slow-motion collapse that everyone could see except the people inside the building. And that is where the story takes an unexpected turn. In 2011, under mounting pressure from investors, Lazaridis and Balsillie both resigned as co-CEOs. It was a moment that symbolized the end of an era, even though the company's formal collapse was still a few years away. The new leadership brought in Thorsten Heinz, a German executive from inside the company who made bold promises about what was coming next. That next thing was the BlackBerry 10. A brand new operating system, built from the ground up, designed to compete directly with iOS and Android. RIM, which had by then rebranded simply as BlackBerry, bet almost everything on it. When BlackBerry 10 launched in early 2013, the reviews were surprisingly warm. Tech writers acknowledged that it was genuinely innovative. The interface was fluid and elegant. The keyboard, on the physical models, remained the best in the world. There were things BlackBerry 10 did that iOS and Android simply did not. But it was too late. The app ecosystem was still years behind. Developers had spent 5 years building for iOS and Android, and most of them had no intention of spending resources on a third platform with a shrinking user base. Consumers who had left BlackBerry during the dark years had rebuilt their digital lives around Apple and Google, their photos, their apps, their habits, their muscle memory. Asking them to switch back was asking them to start over. BlackBerry 10 sold poorly. The company reported a nearly $1 billion loss in a single quarter. The stock, which had once traded above $200, was now struggling to stay in double digits. The device that presidents refused to travel without was becoming a punchline. What followed was a series of survival moves that illustrated just how far BlackBerry had fallen. The company sold its real estate. It cut thousands of jobs. It licensed its brand to other manufacturers in an attempt to stay relevant without the cost of building hardware itself. It pivoted aggressively into enterprise software and cybersecurity, areas where its legacy of security and trust still meant something. And in a move that felt almost poetic in its irony, BlackBerry eventually announced it would launch Android phones. The operating system that had helped destroy it would now be its lifeline. There was a moment in 2016 that captured the entire arc of the company's story. BlackBerry released a phone called the Priv, a high-end Android device with a physical keyboard that slid out from behind the screen. It was clever. It was well made. It received decent reviews. And it sold, by modern smartphone standards, almost nothing. The brand had been too damaged. The trust had been too eroded. The window had closed. By 2022, BlackBerry officially ended software support for its classic devices. Phones that had once been the most important communication tools on Earth stopped functioning. A chapter in technology history closed quietly, with no ceremony and almost no public notice, which is perhaps the saddest possible ending for a company that had once been impossible to ignore. But the story of BlackBerry is not simply a story of failure. It is a story that contains lessons so clear and so universal that business schools around the world still teach it, and probably always will. The most important lesson is this: RIM did not fail because they stopped being good at what they did. They failed because what they did stopped being enough. The company was genuinely excellent at building devices for a specific kind of user, the busy professional who needed reliable, secure wireless email. That excellence was real. The engineering was real. The security was real. The customer loyalty was real. None of it was an illusion. But excellence at yesterday's problem does not protect you from tomorrow's disruption. And the deeper problem was that BlackBerry's very success had made it psychologically impossible for the company to see the threat clearly. When you have spent a decade being right, the idea that everything you believe might be wrong feels not just incorrect but offensive. That is the trap that catches the best companies. Not arrogance exactly, but certainty. The certainty that comes from having been proven right so many times that you stop asking whether you might be wrong. There is also a second lesson that often gets overlooked. BlackBerry understood enterprise. They understood the government. They understood the professional who needed ironclad security and flawless email delivery. What they never fully understood was desire. The iPhone was not more functional than the BlackBerry in 2007. In many measurable ways, it was less functional. But it made people feel something. It made them feel like the future had arrived and they were holding it in their hand. Desire moves markets in ways that specifications never can. And a company that only knows how to compete on specifications will always eventually lose to a company that knows how to compete on emotion. Today, BlackBerry as a hardware company is essentially gone. But BlackBerry as a software and security company still exists, still generates revenue, and still serves enterprises and governments that value its legacy of protection. It is a ghost of what it once was, but it is not nothing. The name itself carries a strange kind of weight. Ask anyone in their 30s or 40s about their first BlackBerry, and watch what happens to their face. There is almost always a flicker of something, nostalgia, maybe, or the memory of a time when that small device with its satisfying keyboard felt like the most important object in the world. That emotional residue is the last valuable thing the company has. And whether it can be converted into something commercially meaningful in an era dominated by giants like Apple, Google, and Microsoft is a question that remains genuinely open. What is not open is the verdict on what went wrong. BlackBerry had everything: the technology, the trust, the customer base, the government relationships, the brand power. It had more advantages than most companies ever dream of. And it lost. Not because someone stole from it. Not because the market was unfair. But because success had made it blind, and blindness in a fast-moving industry is always, eventually, fatal. The next time you pick up your smartphone, whatever brand it is, whatever operating system it runs, take a moment to consider what it replaced. And ask yourself whether the company that made what you are holding today is asking the right questions. Or whether they are making the same mistake that once made the world addicted to a little black device with a keyboard. Because somewhere, right now, in a garage or a university lab or a glass office building in a city you have never heard of, someone is building the thing that will make today's giants obsolete. The only question is whether today's giants can see it coming. Subscribe for more.